Now that we are performing the navigation using Prism, during this lecture I want to, now that we are in this new book page, actually be able to search for new books so later on we can save them. For this we're going to be using the Goodreads API as I mentioned. And the Goodreads API has this very useful feature that allows us to find books by title, author, or ISBN. So over in the resources for this lecture you're going to find a link to this page, the Goodreads API, and you will be able to search for defined books by title, author, or ISBN. Here you're going to find the URL that is going to be the one that we will use to make the requests. You see how the method is a get method and the parameters that we're going to need. Basically, all we need is the query, which of course is going to come from that search bar that we already have, and the key, which you will have to pass. So go ahead and open this developer key link that is going to redirect you over to creating your account. Basically, it's going to give you a key that you will have to pass to your requests. So just make sure that you have that key and you're actually good to go. Eventually, you're going to be able to make these kind of requests. Notice that we are going to have that URL that we have just seen with the search index XML endpoint. I pass a queue and I pass the key. And indeed, we're going to be working with XML. Now we've already worked with XML before, so there is nothing fairly new in here, hopefully. And you can actually use XML to C# to create the classes that we're going to need. So hopefully nothing new so far. I am just going to go ahead and copy all of these classes that have been generated by copying the C# over to XML to C#, add them to a new class that I'm going to create inside of the model folder inside of my project. And let me just go ahead and show you how is it that we're going to be making the request. So like I mentioned, basically we created a new models folder. Inside I created this goodreads.c# file, and inside I have all of these classes that were generated over in the XML to C# website. And of course I needed to add a using directive over to system.xml.serialization, and because somewhere in here we have a list of something, we're going to be needing a system.collections.generic using namespace. So this is basically the classes that are eventually going to be deserialized. What I'm going to do is over on the new book VM create a new method. Now basically what we're going to do here in the new book VM is create an event that is going to fire when the user presses on the search button when writing inside of the search bar. This is going to be clear once we run this application and test it, but basically the keyboard actually shows a search key. So we're not going to be listening for every change inside of that entry. We're just going to react whenever the user clicks on search. So I have this class and basically I will create a private. This is going to be void and I'm going to call the method get search results. And I know that somehow this is going to get a string with a query. So we're not yet going to bind this to the actual SAML element, but eventually I actually need the query that we're going to be making. So that is very important. As we have done before, what I'm going to create in here is the XML serializer, for which I need a using directive to system.xml.serialization. And the serializer is going to be initialized right away. By initializing this, we have to pass a type for which we're going to be serializing to. And in that case, it is my Goodreads response class. Of course, this is the main object of the response. Everything else is inside of the Goodreads response. So the XML serializer is going to be using this type. And now that we have the serializer, everything that we have to do now is read from that link. So I am going to create inside of my view models folder a new folder that is going to be called helpers. And inside of helpers, I am going to create a new class that is going to be constants. Now the constants class is going to have a public constant string Goodreads key that is going to hold my key. So it is important that here you paste the value for your key. Of course, I'm not going to show you mine, but here is where you would paste yours. And now that we have this constant variable over here, when we create the URL, we can actually use that key. So I will start by creating, instead of a using statement, web client. Of course, to use web client, I need a using directive to system.net. And inside, I am going to be getting the XML directly. So the XML is going to be equal to what the client, the web client, is going to download from the string. And we know what the string has to be. So I am basically going to get that string and format it in the way that it is supposed to. So if this is the main string, well, I know that where I have this small query, I have to pass the query that this method is receiving. And as a key, I'm going to pass what I already have in constants. I will add my using directive, and in constants, I already have my Goodreads key. So basically, we're creating that URL with this format, we're getting the data, and of course, the data cannot be directly transferred to a string. For that, I will use, as we did before, encoding. To be able to use encoding, I add a using directive to system.text, and encoding has a default property which has get string method, and this get string method can get that array of bytes. And so now we have the XML. All we have to do now is the serialize. So for that, remember that we need a stream reader. So again, instead of a using statement, I will define a stream. For stream, I need a using directive to system.io. This is going to be called reader, and it's going to be equal to a new memory stream. And memory stream is going to get the XML as bytes. So encoding using UTF-8, I am going to get the bytes from that XML. And finally, with the serializer, I can deserialize that reader. Of course, this serialize is going to return an object, and I would like the actual Goodreads response. So if I want to get it, I will have to cast this as a Goodreads response. And now that we have this Goodreads response, the response inside of the search is going to have a results, and results has a list of work. So this work is actually going to be a list that is going to contain all of those books. You can of course notice the structure over in the XML. Here is that list of works. Each work contains a best book object, and it is inside of this best book object that we have the title, and we have the author, and we even have some image. So with this, we're going to be able to list the results. So before we do list those results in the list view that we already have, which is actually going to be very easy, all we need is an observable collection, and with that object that we already have here, just populate that observable collection. We still have to bind the command that is going to execute this method. So what is that we have to do? Like I mentioned, over in our view for the new book page, inside of the search bar, we have a search command, which again is going to be executed every single time the search button is pressed. Again, that search button appears in the keyboard when the user is typing inside of this search bar. So let's go ahead and define here in the view model that command. We'll define that new property of type iCommand. Of course, to be using iCommand, I need a using directive to system Windows inputs, and this is going to be called search command. And just like we saw in the previous lecture, we're going to be creating this search command as a new delegate command, contrary to the normal command that we used before. Now, this command does require a parameter, so we need to use the generic version of the command and let it know that the parameter has to be of type string. So in here, again, just like we did with command, with delegate command, we can pass the type of the parameter, which is going to be string. And finally, we're just going to pass get search results as the action that has to be executed whenever the command is well executed. And so there you have it. Now all we have to do is actually bind this. What I'm going to do is actually set a breakpoint in here to show you that the response does contain everything that the XML is returning. And over here in the SAML, I am going to be setting the search command to be binding over to that new search command that we have just created. Now, the interesting thing here is going to be binding the search command parameter, because we don't really have any parameters in here, any properties that we can bind, but what we can bind is the text for this search bar. So if we want to bind the text for this particular element in which we're setting the command parameter, we don't need to do anything too complicated, like creating a new parameter and implementing the identify property change or anything. All we have to do is set a name for this element. Let's call it book search bar. And here in the binding, I'm going to be using the text property for this search bar. So notice that the search bar has a text property. That is the property that I want to bind here. But I do need to set the source, because the source is different than the source for the search command. So the source is actually going to be this particular element. So I can use the famous X that we have been using to set the name and use reference and reference this particular element, the book search command. And so what this will do is that it will use this element, the book search command, and it will get its text property and bind it over to the search command parameter. So whenever the search command is executed, we're going to receive that text in here as a query, and everything is going to be executed. So let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to run this on my simulator. I am going to navigate over to adding a new book, and I'm going to search by ISBN, book or title, whatever book we want. So I have a book right here by my side. I will search for this one, and notice that precisely in the keyboard there is this search button. Now I have this in Spanish. Let me switch it to English, and we have this search button. And so as soon as I press this, the command is executed. We reach this breakpoint, and my response object already contains everything that the XML contains. The important property in the response is the search property. Here we're looking for the results. In the results, we're looking for work, which notice has 7 results. And we see 7 different elements in here. The first one, for example, in the best book object has this title, which is the one that I was looking for. And we have the author object in here with the ID and the name and the ID for the book. So everything is already in here, ready for us to start displaying the information over in the list view. Now, since that is something that I'm sure is very easy for you, we're actually going to be implementing it in the next very brief lecture. In the next lecture, then, we're going to be listing inside of this list view. We're going to be creating yet another command for us to be able to save, which means that we need to add SQLite functionality, which again is something that we have used before. So hopefully it's going to be very easy for you to do. So if you feel comfortable with doing that, feel free to skip the next lecture, because in the lecture after that, we're actually going to navigate over to the book details page from the books page whenever an item is selected from the list view, which is going to be interesting because we're going to create a command out of an event.